I'll turn it over to you all.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I am so glad to see folks here. I know we'll still have some folks coming in and joining us. Welcome to Landing the Plane, from pursuing merger and acquisitions to closing the deal. This is the second of a three-part series about association, merger, and acquisition activity. This is presented by the ASAE Executive Management Professionals Advisory Council, or EMAC for short, which many of you know this by. I am Oyengo Snell. I just want to make sure my volume is where you need it to be. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Um, my name is Oyengo Snell. I am an attorney by trade, an association executive, and adjunct professor at the University of Pacific McGeorge School of Law. I will be moderating today's session. For those of you who with us last week, you heard from a panel of experts about what to consider when your association is thinking about merger and acquisition activity, or M&A, which you'll hear a lot today. But today we're going to explore that next step in the process. Specifically, once you begin this process, it's no turning back. You're in it to win it at that particular point. So it's now starting to look at the things that are going to get complicated, and they can get complicated very, very quickly. So just think about some of these questions as we kind of just ground ourselves. Who needs to be in the room? What is the right role for advisors and outside legal counsel? How can you best involve your board? How can you best involve your senior team and your staff? This webinar is going to guide you through those particular nuts and bolts, particularly as it relates to M&A activity and the process, and get into some specific key considerations from kicking off the process all the way through closing the transaction. So with me to explore this topic are three dynamic, tremendous leaders in the association community. Many of them you don't even need an introduction. They have firsthand experience and hard-won lessons learned to share with all of us today, and I'm looking forward to it. They are Diana Steinbach, Chief Operations Officer at the National Association of Wholesaler Distributors. I think she may have some information to share on her whereabouts throughout the conversation today. Many of you may know Diana is a global association leader with extensive experience here in the US, but also on the ground in Europe, including when it comes to M&A activity. Jeff Tenenbaum, a man who needs no introduction in the association community, managing partner at the Tenenbaum Law Group. Jeff is one of the nation's leading nonprofit and association attorneys, and is an accomplished author and lecturer and commentator on nonprofit legal matters, including M&A activity. I was actually looking for one of your books, Jeff, to put on my shelf behind me while we were having that conversation, and I failed. I couldn't find it. And my dear friend, Jay Younger, president and CEO at McKinley Advisors, the leading consulting firm for associations. Jay is a recognized expert across a wide range of areas, including M&A activity, and he is also the 2024 CEO Update Association Trends Association Partner of the Year. So congratulations to you, Jay, on that wonderful accomplishment and achievement. Over the next hour, these panelists are going to share their unique perspectives, particularly, and their hard-won lessons when it comes to M&A activities, and on how to land the plane and ground your association. But before we jump into some of the substance, I would like to invite Zach Walquist, the Chief Operating Officer at the Chicago Association of Realtors, my hometown. Thank you, Zach. Who is also the 2023-2024 EMAC Chair, to say a few words. Zach, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you, Oyengo, and welcome. Greetings from Chicago. It is icy and slippery here today, so I hope if you're in the Chicagoland area, you're inside and warm. I just wanted to take a second on behalf of the Executive Management Professionals Advisory Council to thank you all for attending. If you don't know what our council does, we work with ASAE to develop content relevant to what's current for CEOs and other C-suite executives. And this mergers and acquisitions topic has been something we've been talking about for about 6 months, and Tommy has really shepherded us into finding the experts that you have heard last week and we'll hear this week to bring this content to you. It's clearly a popular content. I feel like this is one of the most well-attended webinar series that we've sponsored. So thank you for being here today. And I hope that you enjoy the content and get a lot out of it. So that's all for me. Back to you, Oyengo and panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach and EMAC, for hosting this session today, as well as this entire series. So let's kick off this conversation. I want to have all three of our panelists share their experience when it comes to association M&A. How has rather it shaped the perspective or the activity that you've been engaged in? How has it shaped your perspective? Give us, so to speak, the 2-minute drill. I want to start with Jeff, and then we'll go to Jay and Diana to kind of help clear up this matter for us.
Thanks, Oyango. Hi, everyone. And I'm not sure which book you were referring to. It could be the ASAE published Association Tax Compliance Guide, which is probably the most important and helpful book of the two I've written. Or it could be the more recent Quarantine Cocktails, which is the one that has pictures and is a lot more fun, but probably not as relevant to the association.
I love these shameless plugs. I love it.
Anyway, welcome, everyone. I'm an attorney in private practice in DC. This is what I've been doing for the last 28 years. Actually got my start working at ASAE when I was going to law school at night, managing the legal section, and have spent the last 28 years representing, probably at this point, thousands of associations, all different types of primarily national trade and professional associations across the country as outside general counsel. And through that have been engaged in countless M&A transactions of all different types and shapes and sizes. Worked a lot with my co-panelist Jay and McKinley Advisors on a lot in recent years, but I've seen just about every type of M&A transaction that I can think of over the years. And so that experience is what I will be kind of speaking from today.
Awesome. Jay?
Thanks, Oyango. Hi, everybody. Jay Younger from McKinley Advisors. I was looking for my copy of the Association Tax and Compliance Guide, which is signed by Jeff Tenenbaum. That's here in the office. Quarantine Cocktails is at home, which actually, depending on the outcome of the merger or acquisition, that actually could be even more relevant and helpful than the Tax Compliance Guide. I see we're off to a great start here. So at McKinley, we typically have 3 or 4 matters pop up every year, mergers, acquisitions. So we're constantly dealing with this environment, and we've seen a lot of activity and interest in this, particularly recently. I think, if you had asked me this question 10 years ago, there wasn't much going on, and I think there was a kind of a sense that associations were somewhat immune from M&A. But recently, within the last few years, which I think does have some specific connection points to the pace of change these days, what members are looking for from their organizations. We're seeing a great uptick in this. And so we've been refining our approach and our methodology to help organizations figure these things out. The one thing I guess I would offer, just in terms of what's informed my perspective on this, is that the overall success rate that we have observed is about 50%. So go into it with an understanding that it doesn't necessarily become a foregone conclusion that the deal is going to happen. There are a lot of things, and Jeff mentioned some of the matters that we worked on together. There are a lot of things that can happen at every step along the way, and staying nimble and agile and not getting too particularly wedded to any particular outcome would be something I guess I'd offer right up front. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, Jay. Diana?
Sure. Thanks, everybody. So yeah, I, from the association executive perspective, have been involved in various types of mergers, acquisitions, whether it's the acquisition of an event or a program to whole organizations. And that's been since the 90s. And at that time, like Jay mentioned, it was something that a lot of people were very surprised about. But I've found it to be a very viable and lucrative option for associations or societies, whether you're looking at another not-for-profit or you're looking at a for-profit entity. You can do it to do a number of things: grow revenue, grow your network, expand your services, remove the competition. You can do it to remove the competition both for spend and for mind share. So there's a lot of different reasons why you would want to do this. But you need a good strategy, and you need enough money not just to buy something, but you need enough money to invest in it, because a lot of people sometimes don't complete the work. But it's fitting that I'm speaking to you from New Orleans, the land of jazz, because I would say M&A is like the jazz of business deals, right? It's about feel and improvisation. You have to have a lot of EQ really to do this, because it's all about the people. It's about egos. It's about greed when it comes down to it, sensitivities. But at the same time, you also need an eye for detail and the ability to really articulate the art of the possible. So there's a lot of creativity. And then I would say, like every good musician, you also need a good lawyer and a good accountant to make sure that your creativity turns into the success that you intended.
Yeah. Diana, what I liked about what you, Jay, and Jeff stated, you kind of gave the academic approach, but then some practical realities and some things you got to look out for and think about as you're moving through this process. Diana, I want to start with you to kind of get us kicked off here, but I don't want to make assumptions. Everybody comes to this conversation or to this space from different backgrounds, different walks of life, diversity in its fullest form. I want to level set. So before, I know some of this may have been talked about last week at last week's webinar, but I want to just ground us a little bit and kind of, it's important for us to kind of resurface this. So when it comes to the difference between mergers and acquisitions, in your experience, how do you see the difference between the M versus the A in M&A, pun intended?
Right. No, absolutely. Well, I'll admit that I have never done a deal where two entities were coming together equally, which equally is in air quotes for sure every time, to create sort of a new entity. Almost everything I've done has been either a 50-50 deal to own something, or a 50% buy-in as a way to help the seller feel a little bit better about losing the control, with the first option to buy them out, and then rolling that into 100% buyout. There's also the fact that people can merge in, but they become a division. So they're really sort of a bit of a subordinate, but you can find ways to keep them feeling intact with their brand identity and so forth. I think another thing that people have to understand too is sometimes the people who are most willing to talk to you about selling are possibly wounded or dying. And there's a reason that they are not sticking with what they intended to do. So Ed's asking about a joint venture versus a merger. Right. So you can go into a joint venture with somebody where you're really 50-50 owners, and that might be different than an actual merging of two entities 100%. But the other thing too is you have to look at whether you're buying just their assets, or is this a stock deal, because there's liabilities, there's staff involved. You have to look at those different aspects as well. But really what it comes down to is it's very hard for something, in my experience, to be 100% 50-50. This is somebody is eventually taking over the decision-making rights or the ownership of something when you're acquiring, or you're having a merger underneath a larger entity. And so that's what I would say is what I've learned.
Yeah, to Ed's point, I've been engaged in a lot of those joint ventures, right? The two entities maintain their own independence and their legal status. As it relates to a merger, somebody's giving up something, which is why you talked about those egos and those sacrifices that come into play. So I appreciate your thought process on this. Jay, can you give folks just a little bit more insight from your perspective in the difference between mergers and acquisitions, but more or less, how does it drive your M&A counsel, the guidance that you provide to your clients?
Sure, I'll spend a little more time on the merger because we've had comparatively more experience there. Diana and I did not compare notes in advance, but I guess conveniently, I'll talk a little bit more about what we often call mergers, which is about creating something new. So what I would say, and Jeff could certainly weigh in on this from the legal perspective. Often it's actually not a merger. Technically, when you're bringing two organizations together that have an interest in affiliating, consolidating, merging for all practical purposes, right? It's about creating new org. It's about taking the best of both organizations, thinking about a grander vision and mission for the field or industry that those groups represent. It's often driven by people who pay dues to both organizations, who are tired of that and saying, you know, there's really not a lot of difference in what you guys are doing, and it's time to unify and come together for the good of the industry, the profession, the members. And so the new org efforts, the merger efforts are very robust. There is a ton to work through. Everything that you can consider in the association ecosystem, from governance to strategy, finance, people, programs, volunteers, real estate, you name it. All of that needs to be worked through if you're going to go ahead and go forward with a new org vision, which are compelling and often what the industry or profession really needs. One of the things that's happened just, I think, organically in our space is that it's not uncommon to have multiple organizations, sometimes dozens, representing essentially the same constituencies. And that really can lead to a watering down of, particularly in the advocacy arena, the voice of a group. Now, that sounds great, you know, at the surface, but when you start to line up all these things that I've just mentioned and what it takes to actually consolidate, don't go into it lightly, but it is possible. There are a lot of different pathways. There are a lot of different avenues that you can pursue. And with the right set of leaders, the right market environment, and the right kind of guiding principles, these deals can happen. Again, they're comparatively harder, I would say, than straightforward acquisition. But you know, if there's an appetite in the field, in the industry, to do something bigger and bolder, that you know, we've seen that can create some real upside. If it's a merger in sheep's clothing, I don't know exactly how to say this. If it looks like an acquisition and it smells like an acquisition, it is. So, you know, if it's not at least quasi merger of equals, and one group is essentially jettisoning everything, it's probably a takeover, right? Yeah, Lauren, exactly. Good example that we've seen recently in the headlines of NAFCU and CUNA coming together to do that, you know, something bigger, something bolder. Another big one that some may be familiar with is American Clean Power Association, formed as a byproduct of several different mergers actually that took place over the last few years. So that's what I would offer in terms of the merger point of view, and we can get into more of that as we keep moving forward.
Thank you, Jay. Love the practical approach and just the guidance and just different key points that you point out that people need to be aware of when they're in this process, right? They've already made the decision. Now they're in this process. Some of the key things that they need to be thinking about. Jeff, I'm coming to you, and I set this. Jay and Diana set this up nicely for you because as lawyers, we think different. We think a little bit. We're sometimes out in space. Kind of thinking about different ways this can all get messed up and if we don't put certain things in place. So from your perspective, in the counsel that you give, coming from it from a legal lens, how do you approach association mergers versus acquisitions differently? And are there methods or combinations that our attendees should be thinking about from a legal liability perspective? I always say have the lawyer in the room from day one when you're starting to think about it, but I don't know. What's your thoughts?
Well, first off, I do say that as well, and not just not from a selfish perspective, but from the perspective of I've seen it happen too much where the lawyers are brought in later, like seemingly to draft a merger documentation or asset purchase agreement or whatever, but they don't have a hand in structuring the deal. And partly I feel like when I get involved, and I get involved in all sorts of M&A transactions, every type, like I said, I've been doing it for a long time, from very big to smaller asset acquisitions and everything in between. And one of the things, I feel like I'm part lawyer and part consultant because, sorry, Jay, I'm not trying to intrude on your territory, but the two overlap a lot. And one of the things I try to do early on is to make sure that whether it's my clients, usually I'm representing if there's two parties in a transaction, sometimes there's more than two, but let's just say it's a two-party transaction. I'm usually representing one of them. Sometimes in some smaller M&A deals, we actually with conflict waivers represent both sides because they really can't afford to have separate legal counsel. But generally, for most transactions, I'm representing one side, but I want to make sure that both sides understand the various different options that are available. A true merger, like Jay said, actually rarely happens. We rarely see it in the association community. A merger is where one, say, Association A merges into Association B, and Association B is the surviving entity, and it assumes all the debts, liabilities, assets, and whatnot of Association A, and it carries on in the form of Association B. We actually don't see that a lot because a true merger requires for membership associations a membership vote of both organizations. Whereas if it's just merely an asset transfer and then a dissolution, it only requires a membership vote of the dissolving entity. And that can be politically a big and important issue. There's another form of a transaction. We're talking kind of whole entity transactions called a consolidation. We rarely see that. That's where Association A and B come together and form Association C as the new surviving entity. We rarely see that just because it's a lot more complicated. You generally have to go back to the IRS, reapply for recognition of tax exempt status and all of that other stuff. What we actually see the most of is an asset transfer and dissolution that for all intents and purposes looks and smells like a merger. It's actually usually called a merger in the press, but actually oftentimes it's not a true merger. It's just Association A takes all of its assets, dumps them into Association B with a negotiated agreement as to what kind of the new structure, both governance and management-wise, Association B is going to look like, and then Association A dissolves. That's kind of what we see the most in the whole entity transactions, but making sure that two sides understand these options and also understanding, I think Ed had asked about the difference between a joint venture and a merger. Sometimes, I hate to use this analogy, but it seems appropriate. Sometimes it makes more sense to start living together before you get married, right? And it's the same with association. Sometimes it makes sense to do some kind of a joint venture if the two parties aren't ready to get hitched and pull the trigger on the marriage. Start doing some things together. Have a joint, do joint trade shows, joint publications, joint meetings, some joint committees, and maybe some joint lobbying, joint strategic planning. There's so many things you can do together jointly while still maintaining your separate legal status. And then if it goes well over time, then a merger or some sort of full combination can become more natural later on. I didn't get to talk about like asset purchases and things like that, but I think hopefully this is helpful in kind of setting the stage for what we're talking about here.
Well, the stage is set. I think that kind of gives us at least some ground level thoughts and things to consider. And just kind of coming into this topic, I want to turn to best practices and key considerations. But before I do, please, if you have a question or a comment, go ahead and throw it in the chat. We're going to try our best to get to them, as many of them as we possibly can. May not have a lot of time at the end, but we're going to try to do our best. I want to pivot, Jay, back to you, Jay, because I think Jeff really set the table nicely on talking about the legal considerations. I want to talk more about the framework, and you begin going down that pathway, and you pause. You didn't want to go too far. I want you to bring all of that into this conversation at this particular point and share your thoughts on the framework that association leaders should approach when looking at a true merger or an association. Like, what lens should they be looking at this in? What framework should they be considering?
Yep, absolutely. So if the desired end state is a cohabitation or nuptials, there's some things to do right up front. And in this case, our approach is a little distinct from Jeff's in that we most commonly represent both organizations equally. So we're advisors to the process and are there to manage the project, make sure that everybody has equal access to information, kind of shepherd the whole conversation. So the first is what I would call the concept of a steering committee. So this is not uncommon on any level when two organizations or more are thinking about working together in any form or fashion. Usually the officers start talking to one another, but formalizing that and getting an NDA in place and empowering that steering committee with a fair amount of agency to do the work that is required, because there is a fair amount of work, due diligence, financial modeling, mission, vision, values. If you're really going big and trying to create a new organization, a lot of things have to happen. And so the steering committee helps ensure that the process is as nimble as possible. And that group can be the kind of shuttle diplomacy group that goes back and forth to the respective boards. Sorry about the alarm you're hearing in our building. Everything is actually secure, but the door is broken. Darn it. Steering committee can help with the efficiency of the process. The other thing that I would encourage at the beginning of the process is the development of guiding principles. So I mentioned that earlier. These often come in super handy as discussions get comparatively tense as the merger process unfolds. Those guiding principles are more than just words on a page. They become the tenets, the beliefs, really the values that the steering committee and by extension, the boards of both organizations agree to right up front, that these will be the things we use to make decisions and actually also govern our behavior. Because the conversations can get intense, they can get heated, they can get personal. And so having those guiding principles at the outset really helps. And particularly if you're approaching something that looks at least reasonably close to a merger of equals, if you can actually live that principle, it shows up quite often downstream in things like the board. Are we going to have equal representation on that first board? And so getting some of that stuff sorted out with guiding principles up front is really important. And then finally, just in terms of process and how I would consider it, I would consider it as a series of stage gates. So there's a whole series of commitments that happen along this way, and kind of back to Jeff's analogy of, thinking about spending some time together, moving into, some dating, and then, agreeing to not see other people. And like, there's a reason that people use this analogy, because it's actually got a lot of, connection points to increasing levels of commitment. So you start with a non-disclosure agreement that's comparatively mild. When you get to a letter of intent or an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, those can be binding or non-binding, but you're going to that next stage gate and saying, oh, we've seen enough that we like, we're ready to go to the next stage. So on down these stage gates, eventually winding up in a set of legal documents, definitive agreements that govern the terms of the deal. So chunking that out, to use the technical term, and understanding what has to happen at each stage gate is something that both parties need line of sight on early. And it's not uniform. Some groups like to pull comparatively more forward and have squared away and finalized before, for example, the letter of intent. I've seen letters of intent that actually go into a fair amount of detail on how the governance structure is going to work. They want those things ironed out before moving to that next level. In other cases, particularly where speed is important, some of that stuff waits until later. And they say, we have a good level of trust. We're gonna move quickly through those stages and get right to the the deal closing, so to speak. So hopefully a few helpful thoughts there.
Absolutely, and I'm loving the conversation that's going on in the chat and when looking at nonprofit and for-profit entities and merger of assets versus actual merger. Jeff, thank you for clarifying the legalities there. I'd like to expand that thought process and deal with those questions with the next question, Jeff, that is kind of posed to you to bring you back in here. In thinking about mergers and thinking about the pain points and how executives should be, what lens should they be thinking about when approaching mergers, and definitely elaborate on some of the components that's going on in the chat as versus nonprofits versus merging with for-profit entities, which can't, but you've clarified how you go about it. But then also, what are some of the practical tips or tools that people should consider when embarking upon this, especially when you have dual representation? That's another point that came up in the chat. As counsel, as a consultant, how do you have dual representation of entities that may have opposing or competing interests?
All right, a lot to unpack, a lot to respond to here. I'm going to respond quickly to two of the questions in the chat and then give you kind of some of those kind of, from my experience, key pain points and how do you overcome those. So first off, someone in the chat, Diana, of course, mentioned the use of a for-profit subsidiary. So depending on what assets you're acquiring and if they're revenue generating assets, if these are assets like, say, a trade show, where it's a trade show that meets the requirements of a qualified convention and trade show under the UBIT exception, then you can take that in under, say, a 501c6 association, and it's going to generate tax-free revenue. But let's say it's something that's an unrelated activity, like a group purchasing program or something like that. then that would generate unrelated business income to the tax exempt organization, potentially a lot of it. So you'd probably want to either create or dump it into an existing for-profit taxable subsidiary. So always keep that in mind. And this is where I was talking earlier about making sure you're aware of all of the different options. Because sometimes these deals we get involved in are multifaceted and complex. Some assets might have to go into a for-profit subsidiary, some might go into a C6, some might go into a C3. We've had many multi-party deals like this, including the one that I negotiated back in the day, my God, decades ago for ASAE when it merged with the Greater Washington Society of Association Executive, and was actually a four-party combination. To Ed's question about dual law firm counsel representing both sides, look, to me, that's not the ideal situation. I don't prefer that. I don't like it. Like I said, I've only really done it in situations where there are really two small associations that really can't afford their own legal counsel. So they agree to split legal counsel fees. And what I tell them is with conflict waiver, we can do it, but you guys have to negotiate the business terms. We can't give an advantage to one side or the other. That's not ideal. That's just not ideal. And especially when the two sides are not co-equal, and they almost never are. That's just a really difficult situation. So it's far from the ideal scenario. In terms of kind of pain points and how do you kind of overcome some of them, a few things. First, Jay talked about having a steering committee, whatever you want to call it. I agree with the concept of having like a few key officers, maybe 3 or 4 at most, volunteer leaders, having the CEO involved, maybe like the COO if there's a strong number 2, and legal counsel from each side. And if there's 3 sides, maybe you got more than that involved in the negotiations. But I think I've seen some missteps in the past where the officers get involved in these discussions before they bring in staff. That's always a dangerous thing. Of course, with staff, sometimes the ideal time for a full-on combination is when one CEO is going to be retiring or leaving and where there's a vacancy, because that makes it a lot easier. The co-CEO model, in my experience, never works unless it's just for a brief transition period. And so sometimes the timing of the CEO, but having everyone involved and getting that alignment between the board and the staff and legal counsel early on is really important. Control is probably the key pain point always. Whether you've got 2 co-equal organizations, when you have one bigger, one smaller, the smaller is always afraid it's going to be swallowed up and not going to have a voice in the surviving association. So doing things to help ensure that they're going to have a voice, control, even if it's just going to be a division of a larger association, maybe having some semi-autonomy over their key programs with some sort of a governing council or something like that is really, really important. Making sure you don't bring the membership in too late. I have seen these mergers, I'm going to call them mergers, but as we know, it's often not a true merger. But I've seen some of these fail in the end because oftentimes you need a membership vote to get this approved, whether it's a full-on merger, asset transfer, and dissolution. And if you don't communicate with the members, bring them along, educate them, have town halls, things like that, you might not get the approval. And sometimes you got a 2/3 approval requirement and whatnot. And if you don't have good, clear, transparent communications with the membership, it can often not work. And then, I guess the last point I'll make is that, when Jay said earlier that 50% of mergers in the association world in his experience fail, what he means, not that the negotiations fail. I don't think he means that. I think he means they fail in terms of being successful down the road, that you don't have that full integration. And while there's a lot of things that factor into that, right? Culture, finances, what the members decide to do, everything else. There's so much you can do structurally in terms of how the surviving board or boards are structured, how the committees are structured, what sort of overlap you have between boards if there are like, C6, C3 or multiple entities, who serves in key leadership positions. You really want to do everything you can, both structurally and operationally, to ensure as much integration as possible amongst the staff, amongst the volunteer leadership. And I'm dealing with one right now that is a client that is unwinding a merger. And the reason it's primarily being unwound is that the senior staff did a really poor job at integrating the organizations. They just didn't do what they needed to do to integrate the staff, to integrate the programs, to help create synergies between program A and program B and program C and figure out, how to capitalize on all of that. And if you fail to do that, you can almost ensure there's going to be a failure of the combination in the end.
Thank you, Jeff. One of the things that we didn't even contemplate to talk about is bringing the members into play. Thank you for introducing that thought process into this piece, right? Because we think of the people who are supposed to be doing the deal, the officers, the board, the CEO, the senior team, even the outside consultants. But what about the members that have to vote on this? Appreciate that perspective. Jay, very, very quickly, I want to address before I go to Diana, I want to address the relationship, the dual relationship role. How do you balance that dual relationship quickly, if you will?
Yeah, so it's just, it's about being transparent and advisors to really the process that both parties have agreed to undertake. And Jeff's point about legal representation aligning to each party is what we also lean on heavily. So whether it's legal, tax, accounting, individual and independent advisors in both sides of the transaction, absolutely essential. Our job is to steward and shepherd the process, make sure that the groups are set up for success in terms of how they're going to have the conversations. Again, as Jess said, getting to the terms of the business deal, what we sometimes call a plain language model. So our deliverables are intended to satisfy the needs and expectations of both parties. They don't always see it the same way, right? But and again, that's where we rely on the other members of the advisory team to work in their individual delegations, so to speak.
Thank you. I wanted to bring that in because the question was based on how do you manage that dual relationship role, right? What are there are some inherent conflicts built in that in and of itself. How do you kind of balance? How do you balance through those? So appreciate both you and Jeff's perspective on that part. Diane, I want to turn to you. Last week there was the discussion of so many whys. Why would you even enter into a merger or an acquisition? Looking at it from an acquisition perspective solely or exclusively, there's new capabilities, new programs, the opportunity to enter into an international market, which you've been engaging in some conversation in on the chat. In the acquisition transaction space that you've been a part of, how is your role as an association executive different, right? We've talked about kind of the board functions and the council functions, but as the association executive, him or herself, how do you see the role of the association leader when it comes to making these types of strategic acquisitions?
Sure. So it in some ways it can be similar from deal to deal, and in terms of some of the responsibilities that you have. But one area where it can differ is based on your board's level of experience with this. So for instance, if you come from a trade association and you have board members who are used to doing deals in their own businesses, that can be in your favor in terms of understanding how these deals operate, not having people want to get into the weeds of the details or micromanaging. If you have a society even where there are people who are used to having deals done in their own businesses that they work in, that can be helpful. But you could also end up with a board that is really not used to this kind of business engagement. And then you have to be more of a teacher and a handholder to help them understand what it is that we're doing, how this typically works. Sometimes you have to explain things like UBIT and whatnot so that they understand how you can use your reserves in responsible ways, what you have to be careful of. So some of those things when you're working with your board members can differ. I would say typically, like how my co-panelists have mentioned, you typically want to have two different leaders in the association involved. You've got the CEO or the executive director, and then you've got their number two. You're going to end up having to play good cop, bad cop. You needed to figure out who's going to play which and when. If you hire a consultant, then you've got a third party who you can have help you with that. Part of what your responsibility is trying to help people understand the art of the possible and what are the creative combinations that can fuel your strategy. How do you use these to your benefit? Like somebody mentioned early on, when people are saying, I'm fed up paying so many dues to so many people, that may or may not be the best reason for you to be doing this. Sometimes you're doing it what seems like out of the blue for the members or the people involved in the for-profit entity, but it really does relate back to your strategy. So you have to have that vision and be able to see how you can carry it through and how you can communicate that in multiple ways to people who are going to be on a continuum, a different level of being able to see the same vision you have. And that gets into some of the politics. Sometimes you might be working on a possible acquisition. I was working on one for over 10 years. We were working on it until we were able to finally get the right stars to align and the right people in the right places to make it happen. So you have to have some patience with that. There's also really needing to understand what's important to the other party. Even if they're going to be merging into you or you're acquiring them, this is something where you need to have a win-win to get the votes from members or from board members, or just to get the deal done at a price that's reasonable for you. And so you really need to understand what makes these people tick that are making the decisions. Sometimes that may mean that you partner with your board chair so that you can navigate that political minefield together. And it may be dividing and conquering, identifying, prioritizing who are the biggest roadblocks to this decision, and how do you peel those people off, have separate conversations, win them over, so then they can help you win over the next group of people that you need to get the right vote. Helping them understand that what's most important to them can still remain intact, even if they don't have a spot on the board. They might be in a council that has decision-making capabilities for that subset of members. So there's various things that you need to do like that. There's also the risk management responsibility. So that's where you have to make sure that you are doing your due diligence. And that can be tough for people, for a leader who really believes this is the right decision. You also may have to be ready to walk away from a deal, because when you get into due diligence, you can find out that this is not financially viable. Or you could be looking at purchasing a publication and you think that, or some sort of an entity that has lists and contacts and a network that you think is really valuable to grow. And when you peel everything back, you may find out that there's not as much there as you think. And is it still the right decision? Sometimes it can be. You just have to downgrade your expectations and be realistic about what's going on. The other thing that you also have to do too is you have to understand, what are you asking your board members for too? Because when you go to the board, you don't want to keep going to the board every time there's an iteration. I think Jeff and Jay can agree with me that there are going to be rounds and rounds of discussions, backs and forths, ups and downs. And some people are really niggling. They just can't stop asking when you think you've finished off the big parts of the deal. And you don't want to have to go back to your board every single time. So you want to figure out, how do I strategically go to the board at the right moments to give them the business plan, the vision, and the ask? And how do you make sure that ask is flexible? So we're going to approve that you and the chair of the board are able to negotiate up to X. And we know that you're going to offer Y, but you have that room that if you have to go to X, you don't have to come back to us. And then so you have to be able to understand those different nuances so that you can ask that up front and you're not having to kind of dial things back later. And then you really also have to identify, okay, who do you need to bring into it? So as the association executive, you're not always going to have the experience. So do you need to bring somebody in who really understands publishing or events businesses, because that's what you're looking to purchase? Or do they understand, like Jeff and Jay do, in terms of two associations or societies coming together? So who do you bring in at what parts, and how do you have them involved in the process? And then you also have to look at, how do you start thinking of the integration almost at the beginning? Because you have that vision of the macro vision of what is going to be successful, but there's so many steps that have to be done underneath it. So who do you need aligned? Are your people on your staff the right people to actually execute this? Because like the guys had said, you can actually have everything in place. It all makes perfect sense, but the cultures don't fit, or you have staff members who don't understand why they need to incorporate different people in different ways than they've done it before, or restructuring. And again, I can't stress enough the understanding of the long-term investment situation. So you have to have a certain amount of money to do a deal, not just to start, but to continue it. And you may be investing quite a bit after you've purchased it to make sure that everything is integrated properly. So there's many different roles that you play along the way, and you really need to have probably about 2 people within the leadership on the staff side to be able to handle those different roles. And then you're going to be pulling in others as needed.
Oh, yeah, can I respond?
Yes,
That was great stuff,
that was
Diana.
So powerful. It merits a response and not a move on to the next subject.
No,
Please.
that was great stuff, Diana. Just a few quick thoughts in response. When we're talking about the A part of M&A, remember, we're not just talking about the association acquiring. Sometimes we're talking about selling. And that's also I had 2 clients recently, one that sold a big trade show and one that sold a big program. I can't say what it is. One, the trade show, I think everyone views it as being a very successful sale and a good move, and it was taking too much staff time and lack of focus away from core activities of the association. They got a really good deal, great broker, and made a nice profit. The other one gave up a really valuable income source for the association, and I think there's some kind of seller's remorse, at least from some folks there. That's one thing to keep in mind. Second, when you are on the acquiring side, like Diana said, you got to really think hard about what are you buying, right? Like a lot of times what you're buying are relationships or reputation, customer lists. And when that company goes away that you might be acquired, let's say it's a for-profit company or nonprofit, regardless, whoever you're acquiring from, if there are some key people that are key to those relationships, locking them in with employment contracts and non-competes for a period of time, things like that can be really important. You want to just make sure that you're not overpaying, that you know what you're getting, and that whatever you're buying, it's almost never going to work unless it can be more fully integrated with the rest of what your association does. You can create, I hate the word, but it's the only one I can think of, synergies between what you're acquiring and the rest of what the association does. And then similarly, when it comes to kind of like a larger association taking on, say, a smaller association, yes, you always have to be sensitive, like Diana said, to the concerns and needs of the smaller association, but don't overpay, and I don't mean monetarily, but in terms of control. Don't just give in and instinctively say, yeah, we're going to guarantee you're going to have 4 seats on our board for the next 5 years or whatever. Push back, but try to find a balance where maybe they have 1 representative on the board, but they have some semi-autonomous advisory council that oversees their core programs and activities, and keep that in mind. And then finally, the last thing I want to say is that bigger is not always better. We've been talking a lot about coming together, efficiency, synergies, all of that, and it can really work. But a lot of times, a lot of these smaller associations, subspecialties in a given field, were formed for other reasons that it didn't work as a big tent. Like I hear all the time that from a public policy perspective, a lobbying perspective, that sometimes a big tent has trouble advocating because everyone's not on the same page and there's too many subspecialties that have differing interests, and they can be much more effective split off as smaller associations, but maybe still they could do certain things together in a joint venture. So my point of all this is, if a big tent, big association doesn't work for your industry or profession, think about ways where you could still, for instance, advocate separately, but maybe come together through joint ventures to do some other joint activities where it makes sense.
Powerful stuff. Powerful stuff. Thank you, Jeff. And that chime is so necessary to kind of bridge that gap there and look at it from the other view, not just acquiring, but also selling. Diana, I see gems, I hear gems, but it's great when someone can make me feel that there are gems there as far as how association leaders should approach this type of situation from a multifaceted view, being both innovator, advocate, but also referee, and knowing when you need to pull back, when you need to get more engaged in. Jay, very quickly before we transition to the board management and outside advisory relationship, and you can kind of transition us here, is what capabilities or qualifications should associations have when looking at this, and how does that kind of shape your role as an advisor, like at McKinley?
Yeah, I know we're short on time, so I'll try and be super brief. On the acquisition side, it's familiarity with deal making. And I think Diana has demonstrated what that sounds like, is like. And if you don't have experience in deal making and doing this work, hire somebody who does. And you're gonna avoid a lot of the pitfalls, right from the beginning. So somebody who's been there, done that is super important. On the merger side and on the kind of the big tent philosophy that Jeff mentioned, it's really it's on the EQ side, and I think Diana mentioned that too. This is about relationships. It's about building trust. It's about the human side of coming together for something bigger, something better. And those relationships and that trust gets tested, pretty much in every discussion all the way through the negotiation. So you need leaders with, great EQ, listening ability, flexibility, creative problem solving, what sometimes unfortunately is called the soft stuff, Those are the leaders that make the deals happen. And I would say addressing the CEO question right up front is imperative. Don't wait until the last minute to talk about that. It's the quintessential elephant in the room. People are uncomfortable about it, but I think we've all seen a number of deals where that is actually the thing that holds it up at the end. So, you know, that's less of a capability and more of a criteria, but I would encourage everybody to try and like just be very matter of fact about how that's going to work. And sometimes you'll shut the conversation down very quickly because it's not going to work. And you know, that can save everybody a lot of heartburn.
But then sometimes you can come back to that, right? So say it doesn't
Sure.
work, you've seen this happen.
Right.
Then all of a sudden someone announces their retirement and
Yep.
boom, we get that discussion going again.
Most of the new org, the successful new org initiatives that we've worked on have actually been contemplated several times before. It's almost, I can't think of one that hasn't already been tried at least once. So I think Jeff's a good point. Sometimes it's a matter of timing.
And then one related point here, I hear a lot, particularly when there's two co-equal, you know, it's almost rarely co-equal, but when I hear from the smaller association, going back to the marriage analogy, we want to have a prenup provision in the merger agreement. We want to have something that allows us to split off, to get divorced if it doesn't work in the first 3 years or something like that. I've worked on many of these. It's possible to do them. There are ways to do it. I'm not going to bore everyone with the details on this call because we don't have time. But it's difficult to do. It's hard to build them successfully. And usually when you're overly focused on the prenup, the marriage doesn't work. And so to the extent you can avoid that, I would encourage that. And to the extent you have to have a prenup provision in there to get it done, you really want to think creatively and not just allow, you know, one organization to within the first 3 years just be able to split off for any reason or no reason. You know, you want to have it almost be like a for-cause termination where only if certain significant benchmarks are not met, then they have certain rights. And there are ways to do it, like preserving the existing legal entity as kind of an empty shell, post-merger, things like that to make it happen. But just keep that in mind.
Okay. To wrap us up, I'm going to give you a compound question. I want each of you to go through it. And Diana, I'm going to start with you. So the compound question is this. We didn't get into a whole lot of, we talked about it around the edges on that board management relationship, and especially with the outside advisors. And we also busted up some myths as to some things that we should be on the lookout for, some things that's not so clear. So in this compound question, I want each of you to address this. What is the most important fiduciary or governance components that should be considered in dealing with these types of mergers and acquisitions, and what's the role of that you talked about that role of the leader already, Diana, but looking at it from the other viewpoint of the board and management. So that's the first part of the compound question. And then second, are there other considerations or assumptions that folks should be thinking about before jumping into this to these types of activities?
Sure. So when it comes to the board, I think what's really clear is you have to have a strong board chairperson who is on board with what you're trying to accomplish. And it's really a partnership there. I would highly advise that if you feel that you have split decisions or you have board members who really ask a ton of questions and can derail it in the board meeting, that you work with them one-on-one at certain key stages to inform them of where you're at. Let them ask the questions one-on-one with you and the chairman. And then by the time you get to the board meeting, you've got a lot of people who have worked out all those kinks and you can get down to business. You also need to make sure that you're going through the right steps to ensure that your board chairman has reviewed certain things that you've worked on, whether it's the purchase agreement or some of those documents, the LOI earlier on, or MOUs, memorandums of understanding, so that way they can check the boxes in terms of their due diligence and their responsibilities at the board level. And then I think the other thing that you need to look at is the finance side of this too. So if you switch over to Jeff's point, if you are selling, you have to look at, are you going to have an annuity that's X number of years into the future, so that you do unload that responsibility that's weighing down your staff, but you do still have a revenue stream that gives you a little more time. Or do you split off a piece of what you're doing? So the education conference gets split off from the exhibition that you've sold or something like that, so that you still have that. And you always have to understand that no matter how you negotiate, what your say will be, with the new owner, at some point you're going to have the day where you disagree, and you're going to have to be prepared for them to choose something that you wouldn't choose. And so you have to look at that. But when it comes to the financing side, financing can also be creative on the buying side of things. And so people may assume, I'm just going to pay X amount of money for something. I've literally convinced people to give me their business because I could give them a profit margin in a certain structured deal that would be more than they were making by owning it themselves. And so you can work it out where you don't have to pay everything up front. You can stretch it out. I've done a deal where basically we stretched it out by creatively explaining our fiscal year for 5 payments over 5 years, so that we didn't have to drain the reserves so quickly. You also have to look at the cash flow, the combined cash flow of the two entities, because you may need to take more out of your reserves than you expect in order to float the business that first year. So there's a lot of different things that you can do creatively on the finance side that you may not even realize, and there are people who can help you with that. And I know people were asking about international. I'm happy to, that's probably a whole nother conversation, but I'm happy to talk about that, because there's a lot of unique intricacies when you're dealing with doing these deals in another country that you have to be aware of.
Awesome. Jay, give us a minute, and then we're going to have Jeff round us out.
I would echo just about everything Diana said. I would say that, these transactions that, matters of mergers and acquisitions, I don't know that there's any better test of the board staff partnership. And we know that a hallmark of, an effective organization is having a strong board staff partnership. These discussions, these negotiations, this activity will put that to the test, because the board is often relying on advisors, as Diana mentioned, that can be staff, it can be consultants, attorneys, and they're not, in many cases, certainly as Jeff said in the chat, like, we tend to find that the trade association environment is a little faster, a little more efficient, a little more effective when you have people who are used to doing these deals in their day jobs. When you're talking about a professional society, fill in the blank of any profession you can think of where this is not what they do, there's a learning curve there. And so it requires a lot of trust. It requires a lot of rigor and diligence in how you make the case. And I think from a fiduciary point of view, Oyengo, which is, I think, what you asked, it's overused, but start with why. Why are we doing this? And is this the best pathway to get us to that why? Because there are a lot of different options, and you can discover those along the way.
Jeff, bring us home.
All right. 4 points really quickly. First, the board staff partnership that Jay talked about is critically important, but it's not just the chair and the CEO. It's the board and the senior staff. And like Stan was saying in the comments, looping the rest of the staff in while these discussions are underway to the extent you can. You can't always share everything. You certainly can't share everything usually, but looping them to give them comfort to the greatest extent possible is important. I've seen common mistakes made when either the staff or the board get too far ahead of each other in the negotiations. There needs to be square, solid alignment all the way through. In terms of that kind of steering committee that Jay talked about, while it's often like the key officers, along with this, maybe a couple of the senior staff and legal counsel, sometimes it makes sense to bring in other people, maybe just other members, other board members that have unique experience, that represent different segments of the membership, that are going to be not only good at helping to negotiate this, but helping to sell it to the rest of the board and the membership. And then finally, while kind of negotiating the perfect merger or combination on paper, it's definitely no guarantee of a successful outcome. There are plenty of things you can do structurally in how you structure the deal that will make it more likely than not that it'll be successful in the end.
Diana, Jeff, Jay, thank you. Thank you to EMAC. This has been wonderful. I can listen to each of you for about an hour straight on just your perspective. Join us next Tuesday, January 30th, for the final part of this series. Same bat time, same bat channel, as I used to hear all the time growing up. This is going to round this out. You'll get a chance to hear from Ellen Collins, from the Mississippi Alliance for Nonprofits and Philanthropy, Sheriff Karamat with PCMA, who just actually went through a lot of merger and acquisition activity, Pedro McElroy, and Rhea Steele from the School Nutrition Association. So looking forward to seeing you all again. Once again, thank you, Diana, Jay, Jeff. You guys are awesome. Appreciate you. I think everybody here really, really enjoyed it. So look forward to seeing you down the road.
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Be well.
Good luck in your ventures.
All right.